The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I want to talk about Puerto Rico today. I was looking through Donald Trump's Twitter account from the last couple of days, and I saw tweets about James Comey. I saw tweets about the corrupt, failing, fake mainstream media, tweets about Roseanne Barr and wanting an apology from ABC President Bob Iger, but I didn't see anything from Trump about this new report which says that nearly 5,000 people died during and after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And that number is orders of magnitude higher than previously reported. And all along during the recovery, I was saying, just based on reports, right, I didn't make it up, I was saying that the number of dead is being drastically undercounted because without electricity, without communication, without water, with road closures, how do we know how many people are being found dead in remote, small, and rural areas? We didn't know, and now we're closer to knowing. And the Harvard study I'm referencing was published earlier this week in the New England Journal of Medicine. It reminded me that the official estimate for a long time said that 64 people died. 64, when the real number, according to the Harvard study, is 4,645. Why would the official number be 64, and why would it be kept that way as long as possible? Well, a couple different things. Number one, 64 is the number that supposedly died from the hurricane itself, like as the hurricane was going on, but it doesn't include the number of people that died as a result of problems caused by the hurricane. But the other reason why the current administration would have held the number of dead at 64 for as long as possible is because 4,645 dead makes the federal government response look really bad, which it was. It was an immorally bad response. And everything from the trauma caused by the hurricane itself to the disruption of healthcare services, to loss of utilities like electricity and water for people that are chronically ill, disease that spreads when you have no power or no water, and stagnant water, food supply issues, all of these things obviously led to more than 64 deaths. And to put the number in context, right, 4,600 dead, about 3,000 people died in 9/11, right? Yeah. 4,600 died in the Puerto Rican hurricane and its aftermath. 2,400 died in Pearl Harbor. Of course, the population of the U.S. was far lower then, so proportionately we've got to account for that. But this is 4,600 people that died. It is the worst disaster in the United States by death toll in the last 100 years. And yeah, Puerto Rico is in the United States. At the time, remember, Pat, people were talking about, defenders of the administration were saying, listen, we don't have ultimate responsibility for international disasters. Puerto Ricans are American. Puerto Rico is part of the United States. And the big difference is that when we look at the number dead in Puerto Rico versus some of the other disasters that have been bad disasters over the last 100 years, most of the deaths in Puerto Rico would have been preventable given the right response and the right resources. I'm not saying all of them. I'm not saying it's a reasonable standard to say that the government should have been able to mobilize so quickly that not a single person died beyond those original supposed 64. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that many of these deaths would have been preventable had the response been different.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that if the numbers were more accurate during the hurricane and in the weeks after, it would have encouraged more people to contribute to the Red Cross? It would have encouraged FEMA to get there a lot quicker and do more, and
I don't know.
Trump to even try to do something else? Or would people still think that Puerto Rico is just some foreign land that we don't have to concern ourselves with?
There are people that would think that no matter what. I do think you're right that the lack of accurate reporting early on made it seem as though the problem wasn't as bad as it actually was. But part of that is by design. In other words, there was no actual effort made by the federal government, by the Trump administration, to really give an honest accounting of what was going on there. And they stuck with this number of 64 for a very long time, even though we knew hundreds and ultimately thousands of people were dying. And I hate to break it to you, but things are still not going particularly well in Puerto Rico. A friend of mine recently volunteered there in April, teaches high school, and during his break, which was, I think, in early April, during his spring break, he went for a week to Puerto Rico, paid his own way, and then got in touch with people who were volunteering there. He said it's still a terrible disaster, at least was as of 5-6 weeks ago. They were bringing food supplies, helping to set up generators in different parts of the island, and it was absolutely horrible. And it has been at this point, I mean, how long has it been at this point?
Oh, man.
It's been a while. It's been
Yeah.
9 months or something like that. Or,
Maybe not that much, but yeah, last fall, right?
Yeah, last fall, because 9 months, something like that. But look, black women have never been so highly employed in the United States, and that's what Trump has been tweeting about, as well as, you know, Roseanne and how our veterans would be really happy with the economy, despite, you know, having died and being the reason why we're remembering them on Memorial Day. No tweet at all about what's going on in Puerto Rico. These are Americans, and I think that that is something. If I were to have to choose one phrase that sort of epitomizes everything that has been wrong with Puerto Rico coverage and particularly federal government response, it's, hey guys, we're talking about Americans. And that's not to say we shouldn't care about non-Americans, right? Like, it can be very easy to hear me saying, hey, these are Americans, we should have treated them better, as me saying, if they weren't actually Americans, we shouldn't care. But the point of mentioning it is to remind you that this is part of the country that the government completely failed in its response. The moral imperative to help foreigners or not is something we can debate and that I would defend. But what we have to remember is this should be part of our evaluation of Trump's job, because these are ultimately Americans and this is part of the United States. Really, really horrible what's going on right now. And I want to hear from you about it. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and we have just a fantastic program planned for you today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Richard Wilson. Richard, thank you. Really appreciate the support of new members like Richard and, of course, of our long-term sustaining members like today's long-term member of the day, Stan Haslip. Stan has been with us since 2012, going on 6 years of membership. Richard, Stan, thank you. Really appreciate it. You can join Richard and Stan at joinpakman.com. And, of course, Patreon is also available for you at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Let's see what's happening on the phones today. 617-830-4750 is the number. Let's go to our caller from the 626 area code. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey, David. I was wondering if you could help me understand why progressives want minimum wage to be 15. I live in California, and when minimum wage went from 8 to 10, like prices skyrocketed. And I have a lot of friends that own small businesses, and a lot of them had to like sell their business or went bankrupt.
So someone had to sell their business because the minimum wage went from $8 to $10?
Yeah, like they didn't have enough money to pay their employees anymore.
Who was that?
Like, well, I mean, I have one friend in particular that happened to.
What kind of business was it?
It was a restaurant.
Okay. And so what happened was that when the wages went up from 8 to 10, the restaurant wasn't a good business anymore, and he sold it.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was still a good enough business for someone else to buy it, right? So like someone said, oh, this is a good business, I'm going to buy it.
Well, I mean, he had to I guess he got kicked out because he stopped paying.
So did he sell the business, or was he evicted from the restaurant?
Yeah, he was evicted, actually.
Oh, so he didn't sell the business at all?
No, he didn't sell it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, listen, it's not clear. Sounds so. Let's see. I guess I'm not even sure where to go with this one. What evidence so let's talk about the price increase part you mentioned. In what way did you notice that the prices increased when the minimum wage went up?
Well, I mean, I was just a kid, so like I would go to like burger stands near my house, and then when it was $5, it went to like $8. So
the burger went from $5 to $8.
Yeah.
All right. Listen, I mean, I don't know that this is the right time to get into a full discussion of the minimum wage, but I'm not sure that your recollection here is exactly what I would maybe base policy decisions on. But generally speaking, there is an equilibrium wage, and $200 an hour wouldn't be that wage. So like raising the minimum wage to $200 an hour would be bad for the economy. But $15 an hour is actually lower than the inflation adjusted wage dating back to 1968. So there's a case to be made that's relatively uncontroversial. But I'm sorry for your friend that got evicted, and yeah, I'm not sure what else to say, but I do appreciate the call. 617-830-4750. Let's go to our caller from the 202 area code. Caller from 202, go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Packman. My name is, I'm sorry, never mind. I'm from D.C.
You're from D.C., okay. Are we on speakerphone, D.C.?
No, I don't think so. No.
You don't think we're on speakerphone? Okay, good. All right. Just having trouble hearing you. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to try again.
Oh, that's much better, all of a sudden.
I'm from D.C. Okay, great. I'm from D.C., and basically, it's almost expensive here as New York. No one can afford to live here. The only thing that we can honestly think of doing is moving to a more rural area.
Right.
And I'm trying to figure out how long is it going to take for America to come back after Trump? Or
well,
can
but
we?
So hold on a second. Are you saying that D.C. is that expensive because of Trump?
It is that expensive.
No, but hold on. My question was,
honesty.
D.C., my question was, are you saying that D.C. has gotten this expensive because of Trump?
I won't say it's because of Trump.
Okay.
I think that's a little grand, but I'm just saying D.C. has gotten so expensive.
Right.
And it's, we're going to gentrification. And all the people that were here before were being pushed out.
Yeah.
It's just simply unaffordable. And I'm just saying, I know my question is silly and probably really, scaled down to the dumbest level possible.
No. I mean, listen, it's a good question. It's a good question because this is going on in New York City. This is happening in Boston.
Right.
This is happening in L.A.,
right.
San Francisco, Washington, D.C. It has nothing to do with Trump, right? This is way bigger than Trump. Has been going on for a long time.
Right.
I don't know the answer. I've been reading a lot about this problem, and there's one view which is we need way more housing stock, like just way more places to live need to be built. If you've got more supply, then it's going to decrease the demand that allows these outrageous prices to be charged. $5,000-$6,000 for a one-bedroom apartment in San Francisco, right? Crazy prices.
Right.
The other, so that's like a market. That's like a market solution. The other side of it is more regulatory, which is there need to be more subsidies for housing. But all of these so-called solutions have problems, and I have not yet read any good analysis of what it will take to fix this problem, and it's a major, major problem. I wish I had better news.
Nor have I, but thank you for your info. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Really appreciate it.
And we love your show.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Great to hear from DC. Really important issue. I wish I had a more optimistic point of view. Let's go to our caller from 419. 419, introduce yourself and go right on ahead.
Hi, David. I'm Ryan. Do you think James Comey would run in 2020, and would he be a viable candidate if so?
No, I don't think he would run, and I don't think he would be a viable candidate. Is anyone even talking about Comey running? This is the first I've heard draft Comey 2020 type stuff, but I didn't think that it was a real thing in any way.
I've just heard some chatter about it, but I guess maybe it's not as realistic.
It'd be crazy. I mean, whatever we think about Comey, like, okay, so the strongest case I could make for Comey is that he's a lifelong Republican that now is seen sympathetically by many Democrats because of his role in being fired by Trump in the investigation, right? That would be the argument for like crossover appeal for Comey. But the guy is politically toxic at this point, right? Like, I don't think there's any benefit to a Comey candidacy in any way.
Yeah, I agree. I was just curious about your opinion.
All right, good. Glad we agree. Thank you. Appreciate the call. Comey 2020. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, let's go to our next caller. Let's try the 765 area code. Caller from 765, introduce yourself and go right ahead with your question.
Hello, David. Thomas, thanks for taking my call.
Yeah, go ahead.
I enjoy your show. I really enjoyed the segment you did on pseudo-intellectualism. I thought that was very well done and
Thank
very
you.
in-depth, and I enjoy a lot of your programming on that. First question I have is, do you have anything published yourself? Do you have any books or research that you've published? I know you're a university professor.
No, I don't.
Anything in development maybe coming out?
You know, I've been working with a literary agent, a nonfiction literary agent, for probably like a year and a half at this point, just coming up with possible ideas. But we haven't found anything yet that, you know, the idea is a nonfiction book that I would have a unique perspective on, right? Not like just another generic progressive nonfiction political book type of thing. And we've just not found something that is both a good fit and that could be completed in an amount of time where we know that it would still be relevant. That's the thing with a lot of these books, that unless you do it in a very specific way and or with a ghostwriter, it just takes a while to get it done. And so it's something I'm talking to a literary agent about, but nothing in the works yet.
Oh, well, definitely keep us informed, man. I think you got a lot of bright ideas. I want to get to my main question. Have you read up on anything about this Chinese social score that they're planning on implementing in 2020?
Yeah, we've covered it a little bit.
What are your personal thoughts on that? I must have missed a segment, but if you could give me like a brief.
I mean, it's effectively
idea.
like a credit score, but it's like a social credit score. So it goes beyond just your sort of financial reputation, but more a broader reputation. I don't know that it's that useful, and I think the possible risks of it kind of outweigh the benefits. I find it incredibly interesting because I'm really I'm a student of the gamification of different areas of life. So I think that the incentive structures that gamification creates are very interesting and can sometimes have positive effects, but they often also have. I'm sorry, what was that? Oh boy, you're cutting out. Yeah. All right, listen, we're losing you. I think, listen, Pat, what is my position? Please explain to me what my position is on this, if you remember it. I think that basically it's possible dangers. I don't know how much we gain from it, although I'm interested in gamification.
Yeah, I'll have to catch up, do the research, check out your past statements on this issue.
Okay, let's stick with the phones at 617-830-4750. Anytime I see 774, I like to go to it because sometimes it's Pat's friends calling in to tell stories about him. Caller from 774, go ahead.
Hello, this is Ryan from Massachusetts.
Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
Yep. So I want to talk about the gun debate.
I'm sorry, you want to talk about what? A bumblebee?
No, the gun debate.
The gun debate, yeah, of course, go ahead.
Yeah. I don't know, it's like there's like a false debate. Like there's like the right saying that the other position is for banning all guns. Like how do we counter that dialogue?
Oh yeah, I mean that's straw manning, right? Which is, it's much easier to argue against an outright ban on guns than it is against common sense gun safety regulations. So what the pro-gun fetishists like to do is straw man the left as wanting to confiscate guns. Like, and a perfect example, Ryan, is the other day, last week actually, we got a call from someone who said, David, are you in favor of gun insurance and licensing, sort of like we do with cars? And I said, yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think that's a very interesting idea. And I got emails from people saying, in reference to that clip and YouTube comments, you will not take my guns, David. Who's talking about taking guns? We're talking about licensing and insuring them. So it's typical straw manning, Ryan. I don't know the best way to fight against straw manning. If you're getting straw manned, there's something to your actual argument that's hard for them to refute. That's why they're refuting an argument you didn't actually make, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like when Patrick Cruz talks about like the NRA, like and getting smooth from the NRA, like 80 to 90% of the, I think it's like 80% that is actually in favor of the things he's against, like background checks.
Right.
Like the gun owners, they want the regulations. So like,
yep.
You know, I'm surprised like we can't like push our position, right? Like I don't know. But,
yeah, I mean, listen, they control the dialogue. That's the sad reality, right? So if they say we need to fight against gun-grabbing lefties, their constituents think that there are actually all these gun-grabbing lefties, when in reality we're talking about keeping a Second Amendment, which we have, because that's what we have, but working sort of within that framework. Ryan, I appreciate the call. Really important issue, and good thing that you're identifying that that's something that's going on. 617-830-4750. Let's try the 850 area code. Caller from 850. Who's this?
Hey.
Hey, we can barely hear you. Speak up as much as you can.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Hi, this is Wayne from Pensacola, and I'm a big fan of yours, but I have a problem with your ICO interviews. It feels like you don't necessarily know how to critique these concepts, and you've had some ridiculous people on, and I don't feel like you've given enough pushback.
Okay, yeah, fair point. I'll take it under advisement. I mean, listen, we've talked about the ICO interviews, and basically, I've been super upfront about everything that's going on, which is over the last year and a half, we've had a bunch of funding crises, including YouTube demonetization. We had a Patreon calamity as a result of a horrible policy change they made and then retracted. We had our Amazon affiliate link completely taken away. So what we've managed to do, which I think is actually great in a way for the broadcast show, is we can offset or subsidize some of that lost revenue with ICO and cryptocurrency related content that's only going on YouTube. So like it doesn't take up any of the space of the broadcast radio show, doesn't take up any of the space of the podcast or the broadcast TV show. If you just don't care about ICOs or cryptocurrency, since it's only on YouTube, you just skip over it, but it's helping to offset some of that lost revenue without impacting the experience of the broadcast show. So, it's really been working quite well for us, quite frankly.
Well, I actually am interested in cryptocurrency and ICOs.
Gotcha.
But the ones that you have covered, like the worldwide internet one, they're just tacking an ICO on top of something that has nothing to do with cryptocurrency just to sell it to people who don't understand.
Yeah, I don't think that's different than, any company going public doesn't need to go public in the same way that, not all CEOs need to ICO. I think it's a fair criticism, though. I think I'm listening to what you're saying, and I think it's a fair critique.
All right. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate the call. Hey, listen, this is what it's all about. It's about the battle of ideas, right? And that's we're engaging in that battle of ideas. Okay, that's all the time we have. Apologies to everybody we didn't get to. I know there's a dozen or so people still holding, but we will take calls again, just not until next week.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
So for today's classic interview, we're going to revisit the concept of morality without religion. And this is a topic we've discussed on the program many times before. And I think it's particularly relevant right now because we recently did the story where in a debate with Matt Dillahunty, Jordan Peterson argued that you can't really say whether you can have morality without religion because deep down, even atheists who appear to be moral and claim not to believe in God actually do, so we can't really say whether you can have morality without religion. That's the sort of overarching context in which we'll revisit my interview from January of 2016 with A.C. Grayling about morality without religion. I'm joined today by Professor A.C. Grayling, Professor of Philosophy and Master of New College of the Humanities in London. It's so great to have you on. So many people have recommended that we speak to you, and I think a good sort of general place to start would be, you've talked about ethics and morality and religion and humanism. Question one for those who may be uninitiated in the topic. Are humanism and atheism connected? Are they overlapping? Are they different but similar in some way? Let's start there for our audience.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it is important, in fact, to distinguish not merely atheism and humanism, but also secularism, because these are three rather different things. Atheism is a debate between people who have a religious conviction of some kind, the theists, and those who don't, the atheists. And that's ultimately a metaphysical debate about what there is in the universe, what exists or doesn't exist, in particular whether there are any transcendent agencies of some kind. Secularist debate, of course, is about the place of the religious voice in the public square and how much influence it has on public policy matters. And in that respect, a religious person could very well be a secularist, because a religious person could think that church and state matters ought to be kept apart. Now, humanism is an ethical outlook, and it is very naturally the ethical outlook that a non-religious person might hold. Because, of course, if you have a religious commitment of some kind, it's quite likely that you think that your moral outlook, your behavior, your relationships with others should be governed by what a deity says or desires, requires of you. Whereas the humanist, having no religious outlook, will say it's our responsibility to think very seriously and carefully about how we're to live our lives, what kind of people we're to be. That's the great Socratic challenge, and also how, very importantly, we're to relate to others. So there is a natural connection between atheism and humanism, but it is possible for non-atheists, let us say, agnostics perhaps, or even people who have a very liberal view of religion, perhaps a kind of deistic residual religion, to think that their ethical reflections ought to be premised on concerns about what it is to be human.
I'd love to get a little bit into the discussion around ethics and what is ethical. And in many of my conversations with those who say they are devoutly religious, one of their main sort of, when you ask them why is religion needed in their mind, they say, well, religion gives us a moral and ethical code. And without a moral and ethical code presented by religion, any analysis that we make about what actions are or are not ethical would be sort of arbitrary in a sense. Now, for example, Sam Harris in his book, The Moral Landscape, he says, no, actually, science can tell us what is good or bad. We can make objective determinations about increasing well-being versus decreasing it, and we can get a sort of ethical code as to what is good or bad from science. I'd be curious where you fit into this debate.
Well, let me say first that it's very important to distinguish ethics and morality. I mean, people who use the conjunction ethics and morality think that they're speaking about the same thing, but actually they're wiser than they know. The idea of ethics comes from an ancient Greek concept of ethos, which means character. And so when we have thoughts about ethical lives, we're thinking about that question I mentioned earlier. What sort of people should we be? How should we live? What values should shape and color our attitude towards life? Morality is a much narrower thing. It concerns the question of our responsibilities towards one another. And moral outlooks change over time. Rather like a pendulum swinging backwards and forwards, you get more and less liberal attitudes, more and less puritanical attitudes. But ethical reflection can very often does modify and enrich our moral understanding. So, for example, the position of gay people in society was once regarded with a great deal of horror and outrage and opposition, but ethical reflection on that moral view changed that moral view, and now we have a much more humane and sensible and accepting attitude, which is a good thing, and that is the result, of course, of ethical views. I think Sam Harris's view might, one might express it perhaps better this way, which is to say that reason, the application of reason, and the knowledge that we've accumulated about human nature and the human condition, about human desires and interests and needs, through the great conversation of humankind that is embodied in literature and history and in philosophical reflection, that is what provides us with a very deep and substantial resource for thinking about ethics. And it is that reflection, it is that conversation that we have with ourselves and with one another about the right and the good, about the best kind of society, and about what really matters in individual human lives, that helps us to developing an ethics of generosity and of sympathy and of kindness towards one another, which is based purely on this power that we have, the power of reason and the power of imagination, which enables us to understand how things are for somebody else whose lives we don't share necessarily.
Now, for the religious individual who might hear you and say, well, it sounds to me sort of like a semantic argument, which is that while we can objectively determine what is ethical based on our ability to reason, couldn't our ability to reason or the way in which we reason also sort of evolve or change? And then does it not become just as subjective as saying, oh, religion A says X, Y, and Z about what is ethical? In other words, isn't there the same amount of subjectivity in our ability to reason?
I don't think so. I think there is a great deal of intersubjectivity. That's to say, we learn from one another, we confront one another, we challenge one another, we debate these matters, and we find that there is a great deal, in fact, of agreement and sympathy within groups about how we should comport ourselves. There can sometimes be major differences between groups, of course, that's perfectly true. But this is something which the long unfolding story of history teaches us a valuable lesson about, which is that as time goes by, so I think our societies and our individual moralities do incrementally, inch by inch, sometimes with a step or two backwards for every couple of steps forward, does seem to make progress. For example, I'm very, very impressed indeed by Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which you may remember,
yes.
Shows us that, in fact, societies do seem, slowly and over time, but to be growing really rather much better in these respects. And I would certainly mark this progress by saying the following. Very, very occasionally people say, wouldn't you like to live in some other part of history? And I say, well, yeah, if I could take my dentist with me, certainly I'd like to. It'd be very interesting times in the past to be an observer of. But I wouldn't like to live anywhere other than the modern West and today if I were a woman. So I think that is a marker of just how much progress there has been over history. And this is ethical progress.
I would be interested to hear you talk a little bit about the influence that you believe organized religion has had on society. And you've talked about factors in your writing, which I've read, factors and influences that historically have divided and united human beings. And before we sort of dig into a more specific discussion of this, when you think back over human history, and this is, I think, a good segue given your discussion about living in the modern West as sort of the preferred choice for you currently, what factors have been the biggest dividing factors for humans during observable history, and what factors have been uniting for human beings?
Well, there is a kind of watershed in human affairs, in at least the history of the West, which is that prior to the late 4th century of the Common Era, and in fact, one could even attach a date to it, which is the year 380 of the Common Era, which is when the Edict of Thessalonica was issued, making the Christian religion the only permissible religion in the Roman Empire. That prior to that time, the Roman Empire was very syncretistic. It allowed many, many different religions to flourish. There were many different ethnicities, languages, and traditions within the Roman Empire, which for its time was vast. And so religious practice there was a rather different thing from what we think of it now. For example, the word itself, religio, religere in Latin, means to bind or to bring together. And so the idea was that in the great public festivals of worship of the emperor, as it might be, or of the imperial pantheon, the society was being brought together as a single cohesive whole. But what Christianity borrowed from the mystery religions, which were very much a kind of minority cult beforehand, was this idea of a much more personal relationship, a much more powerful imperial deity requiring something of the individual. And so the idea of religion and religious practice very much changed. And with that change came not the binding together and the bringing together of an empire, but divisions. The first divisions, of course, within Christianity itself, regarding the heretics and the different and sometimes quite powerfully different movements within Christianity, until an orthodoxy was arrived at briefly for a couple of centuries. Then, of course, there was the great schism between Rome and the Orthodox communions. Then there was the Reformation and so on. And unfortunately, with also the outgrowth of Islam, the tensions between the different groups within Christianity and between Christianity and Islam has resulted in a very, very long period indeed of confrontation, religious wars, persecutions because of differences of opinion and the like. And that, I'm afraid, has been a continuing running sore, a cancer, if you like, on history ever since the late 4th century. Now, I don't want for a moment to deny that there have been plenty of good things that have come out of religion, accidentally and directly. Accidentally, I think great architecture and art. After all, artists had to live, and the church had a lot of commissioning power. So as a result, we have some wonderful works of art, paintings, music, and the like, great architecture. But I think on balance and by a considerable margin, the result of this change in the nature of religion in about the 4th century has been a divisive and a destructive one.
Now, if you were to speak to the adherents either of Islam or any particular Christian sect, some of them, as they have told me, would likely tell you, well, it might appear as though our religion or our sect within our religion has been divisive in terms of its influence, but if only everyone just followed our version of our religion, all of that divisiveness would go away. What's the best retort to that? Is it the pragmatic retort that that's just never going to happen, so we shouldn't even think of it, it's just a utopian fantasy? Or is there a different way we can respond to that, that, hey, the divisiveness comes from all of the other sects, not from ours?
Well, of course, this is one of those happy situations where both sides of that conversation just reported, all right. I mean, if everybody agreed with that particular sect, then indeed there would be no conflict. Although human nature being what it is, I'm pretty sure some cause of dissension or disagreement might arise, because we are, after all, a disputatious species. But you also are right. I mean, the fact is that it's extremely unlikely that the different sects will ever agree. I mean, if you look at the history, and we have a rather amusing example here in our own islands in Britain, of the Scottish Church, which is split and split again and split again into ever smaller fragments and breakaway groups. So we have the Free Church, and then we have what are known as the Wee Frees, wee being a Scottish word for small, and then there are the wee Frees, the small Frees, who broke away from the small Frees,
right?
And so on. So I mean, I do think that that wonderful Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, really does sum it up.
We've been speaking with Professor A.C. Grayling, Professor of Philosophy and Master of New College of the Humanities in London. It's really so great to speak to you, and I'd love to have you back absolutely anytime.
Great pleasure to be on your show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Audience questions this week. First one is a good one. I've actually told a lot of friends these stories, and I don't think I've told them on the show. The question is, have you ever overheard people talking about you in Spanish, thinking you couldn't understand? How did you react? There's actually a lot of these stories. And for people who don't know, English is my second language, Spanish my first language. I was born in Argentina. My family's from Argentina, immigrated to the United States when I was 5 years old. So many, many times I have overheard people speaking about me in Spanish. There was one time, I think the first time it really happened notably was when I worked at a laser tag place when I was in high school. And people would come in, I would tell them how much it cost, they would pay, I give them their change, I give them their equipment, blah, 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 blah. And there was a family that came in, the family, it was a Hispanic family, they spoke to each other in Spanish. And there was something I must have done that they really didn't like. So as I was walking away, they hurled some kind of insult at me to each other. They said, this is whatever. I don't remember what the term was, but it was all in Spanish. And I grabbed their change and I went back. And in Spanish, I said something like, a lot of people speak Spanish, and you got to be really careful about who can understand you. And they looked very shocked and very, very embarrassed and did not say another word to me the entire time. And it was the parents, and only the kids were playing the laser tag stuff. So they kind of had to like sit out there in pretty close proximity to me for the entire time.
Wow, no apologies or anything?
No
just
apology
complete
whatsoever, just complete silence, and they were very, very surprised about that. There's been a lot of similar incidents to that. They're not always negative. Like sometimes there will be a discussion, like, you know, in New York City, I would go to a restaurant and I would just say, you know, table for 4 or whatever. And then there would be a discussion amongst the hostess and maybe a waiter or something like that about where it is that they want to seat us. And there will be some question as to whether we would or wouldn't be okay in a certain spot. Like, do they want to sit outside or not? And then I'll just respond in Spanish and say, we'd love to sit outside. And usually there's no conversation. I mean, in New York, it's not actually surprising to anybody. So then it's just kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, let's just go outside. And then only later will they sometimes say, oh, you're speaking Spanish to us.
Yeah.
Or something like that. But the most glaring one is that time at the laser tag thing where the people were actually calling me, you know, a prick or whatever. And I said, a lot of people speak Spanish. You got to be careful.
Do you ever go to like a Mexican restaurant or a Spanish restaurant and insist on speaking Spanish, and they think that you're just some gringo trying to speak it as a second language?
No.
And they'll just revert right back to English? Or
no.
How does that work out?
The only time that has happened, so most native Spanish speakers would identify that I speak Spanish. And the only time that it was different was, I think I've told this story before, I once went on vacation to one of the Balearic, I think is how you pronounce it, islands off the coast of Spain. They're Spanish islands. And these islands are very, very heavily trafficked by both British and German tourists. And there was a restaurant that I actually went to that was a, quote, Spanish restaurant, but it was owned by a German woman. And she spoke Spanish as a second language. In other words, she's German.
Yep.
She moved to Spain, learned Spanish, and runs the Spanish restaurant. I didn't know that she was German because I'm in Spain, so I assume when someone comes up, we're going to be speaking in Spanish. And she assumed that I didn't speak Spanish. And because of my Argentinian accent, because she was a Spanish as a second language speaker, to her it just sounded weird rather than recognizing that it's Argentinian Spanish. So she actually, not only did she insist on speaking English, she corrected my Spanish multiple times in a way that was very, very condescending, as if, because they weren't mistakes, they were just Argentinian Spanish.
This is an outrage.
And she didn't even, her Spanish was so poor that she didn't even recognize what was going on. Like, we got to the end of the meal and she believed that I was just, you know, an American who didn't speak Spanish, and that because she spoke English and I couldn't speak Spanish, we were better off communicating in English. So it was a little bit surreal. I went to Spain and communicated with a German restaurant owner in English.
Like, what do you even do in that scenario? You don't want to give your whole life story.
Right.
You just want to get on with your day.
So I just spoke English with her. You know, what was the point of going any further than that? So, yep, and needless to say, it's happened many times, and in some cases, it's been pretty embarrassing for the other person. Next question today. What would it take to get Fox News to turn on Donald Trump? I think that the Fox News would actually turn on Trump when it's irredeemably gone underwater for him, if it ever does. We saw some hints that there are voices of reason on Fox News, even outside of Shepard Smith. Usually when we do a story and it's, hey, a grain of truth was told on Fox News, it's almost always Shepard Smith. Every once in a while, it's Chris Wallace. We actually have seen some moments where even on like Fox and Friends, which is completely, which has completely blurred the lines between administration and media propaganda outlet, there have been moments of fact-checking on Fox and Friends. They've been very, very small, but they have been there. So I actually don't think that the Fox News apparatus is ideologically committed to Trump. I think that it's part of their business plan, that this is where people turn to if they don't want the failing fake news CNN narrative. But I don't believe for a second that Fox News hosts and anchors are that ideologically committed to Trump. And I think if he's going down, they will turn on him.
Well, I think the business model has been tied to him ever since it became clear that he was going to be the Republican nominee in 2016.
Sure.
So that makes me wonder if in 2020 he has a Republican challenger, like say John Kasich or Jeff Flake, if they would become a little bit more objective and step back a little bit.
Maybe they would not become more objective, but more neutral. We sometimes talk about the difference between objectivity and neutrality. Maybe they would start to, on anything primary related, appear to sort of be just arbiters or unbiased arbiters, just reporters of the primary and not necessarily picking a side. When we know, though, that Sean Hannity is having nightly conversations with Trump, he's basically putting Trump to bed, we found out. it's hard to believe that some of those opinion shows where the hosts are directly tied to Trump are ever going to be anything but completely unabashed, feverish praise of the guy.
Yeah, I think they're going to go down with the ship. Even
I think
if
they are.
Donald Trump gets impeached or whatever happens, like they'll stick with him.
I think someone like Hannity is going down with the ship if the ship ultimately goes down. So it could happen. I don't know that I'd sit around holding my breath for it to happen. Last question today. I know people hate it when we talk about sports, but we do sometimes get sports questions. Do you have a favorite NBA team, player, and coach? I mean, listen, people hate Boston sports teams, but the Celtics are my team. And in fact, over the last weekend, I was in Montreal for Memorial Day weekend. 2 of the three nights I was there were Boston Celtics Eastern Conference playoff games. And I spent the 2.5 hours watching the game because I am a big Celtics fan and have been for a very, very long time. We did lose, and it would have been great if somebody could inform Terry Rozier, number one, that you can pass the ball. You don't have to shoot the ball every time you get it. And number two, that you still get 2 points even if you're closer than the 3-point line. Those would have been 2 interesting things to tell Terry Rozier. But in any case, the Celtics are my team, and I went down with the ship.
So yes, someone has to tell Marcus Smart too that the pull-up three-pointers are not really his thing. Like, he should just move on to something else.
I was really, not that this is about analyzing the Celtics Eastern Conference loss, but there was a lot of that series where it was just hogging the ball, looking for a shot, and if it became absolutely impossible to get a shot off, you pass the ball. That's not the way I like seeing any team play, but especially not the Boston Celtics.
Still our favorite team. They have a bright future. Gordon Hayward and Kyrie Irving are going to be back next year. They could win the championship.
Favorite player? Not really. I mean, I was a big Jordan guy growing up just because of how old I was when I first got into basketball. I still think that he is the best of all time, although I do find him personally to be, not exactly not that NBA players should be role models, but not exactly a role model by any means. I find some of his sort of personal behavior pretty despicable, but Jordan was my guy. And also, I was a big Paul Pierce and Antoine Walker fan during that era. And Antoine Walker, sadly, has lost all his money. I don't know if you're aware of what's happened to Antoine Walker.
Oh, I saw that documentary.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of watching LeBron James because he's just so big and unstoppable. Like, if he drives to the hoop, the ball's going to go in, or at least he's going to get fouled or something, right? And I think that's just a pleasure to watch. And I like that even more than seeing someone pull up a three and make it every time. That's just me, though.
I am not a LeBron fan in terms of his game, but I do think that he's a good guy, and everything that I've heard from him politically, I like. So I actually do like LeBron as a person, but not really as a player. And coach, I mean, again, I grew up in the Phil Jackson era where Phil Jackson was the guy. But in the things that I learned about him and just his sort of condescending demeanor when he was the Lakers coach, I've fallen away from Phil Jackson, and I really am kind of like a Doc Rivers guy at this point.
What about Greg Popovich? He's anti-Trump, and he
political,
gives the best answers to interview questions.
I like Popovich.
They're hilarious.
Years ago, basketball is supposedly invented in Springfield, Massachusetts, although I think James Naismith invented it somewhere else, but then formalized the rules in Springfield, Massachusetts. In any case, the Basketball Hall of Fame is in Springfield. Did I say Boston? I meant Springfield. Springfield, Massachusetts. And when I went to the Hall of Fame induction ceremony of one Irvin Magic Johnson, I happened to be walking into the entire thing right next to Greg Popovich the entire way in. And he didn't say anything to me, but he didn't seem like a bad guy.
I would be scared to say anything to him because he may hit me with some like quippy, witty thing.
I know,
and I wouldn't know how to respond to that.
Yeah, I'd be completely. I would be speech. I would be without speech.
You can't mess with Greg Popovich.
You can't mess with Greg Popovich. Yeah. So look, I love basketball. I know a lot of people don't care about sports, but that's where I am. I am a big Celtics fan, and I will continue to be. And we'll see next year. Next year at the TD Garden, I think, is going to be a very, very good year. We've got a fantastic bonus show coming up for you today. Join today and get access by going to joinpacman.com or by becoming a patron at patreon.com/David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.